diehard Silent Hill fans and endlessly complaining about the Western developed games in the franchise is something that basically goes hand in hand at this point. Lord knows there's hours of reviews, written and video essays, and more all criticizing and tearing down these 4 installments. Hell, there's even about 20 hours worth of content just on my channel alone. At this rate, there isn't much I can say on the matter that really adds to the collective conversation on the Western Silent Hill games, at least in terms of their individual quality. Originally, I planned on doing a series of smaller videos, or one really long video, reviewing all 4 of them, but figured it would just kinda be redundant at this point. It's been nearly a decade since the last one of these was released. Instead, I decided to scale back and look at one aspect connecting all of them. See, there's a common line of thought when discussing each of these, which is that they all just don't feel like Silent Hill games. It's something you hear a lot, even outside of Silent Hill specific discussions. After all, how often do you come across someone making the argument, it's not a bad game, just a bad blank game, fill it in. What I wanted to do today was really break down what exactly makes a Silent Hill game, and whether any of the Western titles really do fail to recapture these elements. Which means the first question we have to answer is, what does make a Silent Hill game feel like a Silent Hill game? Of course, this is all going to be broad stroke stuff, I'm spitballing off the top of my head here, so it's not going to be perfect, but I think this should be a decent set of guidelines to work with. We'll break it down by gameplay, the visuals and art direction, and the storytelling and atmosphere. I have a bit of an odd overall stance on the gameplay of the core Silent Hill games, which for the sake of clarity is going to be Silent Hill 1, 2, and 3 in this discussion. I know Silent Hill 4 has its fans, I've made my stance on that game in the past, which you can watch here. For these 3 games, however, I'd say that the core gameplay is just serviceable. It's not great, it's not bad, it's just alright. It works, and the reason it's serviceable is because the core gameplay is fairly decent, but for the most part, it's just unobtrusive to avoid getting in the way of what really matters about the Silent Hill experience. Which basically is everything else. Make no mistake though, while something like a Resident Evil is better for raw survival horror gameplay, Silent Hill had some core pillars which held it up. While you can argue the specifics, I'd say that there are 3 of these gameplay pillars which really define the Silent Hill games. The level design and the way exploration and progression is implemented, the combat and its balance of power, and the puzzle design. Levels in the Silent Hill games are primarily based on real-world locations with somewhat realistic level layouts to match that. I could see the schools, hospitals, and apartments which make up the locales in these games existing in real life for these specific purposes. Hell, I remember my actual elementary school basically having the same layout as Midwich from the first Silent Hill. While they are believable, the locations are still given the proper care to work like proper game levels. Progression is based on exploring the levels thoroughly with the player scavenging for resources, but more importantly, keys and puzzle items. Backtracking is extremely common in these games, but this is meant to set up a familiarity with the location, as well as streamlining backtracking the further you progress, by having you explore and find shortcuts as you go. You know that feeling when you progress in a game, then find yourself looping back around to an earlier point and getting that little dopamine rush? Yeah, Silent Hill may not do that as often as other games, but it is present here. Basically, Silent Hill levels are less like the large, Metroid-style interconnected maps that you see in something like a Resident Evil, and closer to how most Zelda games handle their dungeon design. Combat is the most often criticized aspect of the Silent Hill games, and I can definitely understand why. It's slow, awkward, clunky, and it feels as if the camera is fighting against you half the time while you're trying to fight the enemies. Besides the camera, which can be a legitimate flaw, the reason for the combat being unsatisfying is definitely more to aid the balance of power. It isn't often that you can route your way around a level to not encounter enemies, so in each level you basically have an active choice between fight and flight. The real challenge the enemies bring to the game is just trying to avoid damage, since most enemies act the same as one another even if they do look wildly different. You either effectively juke and jive the enemies by running around and away from them, with the admittedly solid movement options present, slowly fighting them off with melee to save resources, or just going all out and gunning them down at the cost of ammo. Although this aspect of the games was never great, considering anyone who is really looking will find a truckload of ammo available in Silent Hill 1 and 2. The puzzles themselves are all pretty standard genre fare, with the exception of Silent Hill 2 and its lapses into full-on 90s adventure logic. You know the puzzles I'm talking about. You run around the level in search of puzzle progression items, or the puzzle itself, using that or deciphering a poem to find the result. That's all usually pretty solid stuff, occasionally being pretty damn clever, like the piano puzzle in the first Silent Hill. And they also help to reinforce the exploration aspects of the game by keeping the puzzles and their item-based solutions separate on the map. Rarely are they anywhere near each other. While each game is very uniquely its own in terms of art direction, there are key elements carried over between the Silent Hill titles. And this is because of the work of Masahiro Ito, who worked on the art for all three. One of the most distinct visual features of Silent Hill is the raw attention to detail present in all of them. From bizarre messages scribbled on walls with unclear meanings to vague visual symbolism and complete what the fuck imagery, the game kept the player on their toes with whatever would be around the corner. Seriously, just look at this thing from Silent Hill 3. The fuck is that? Who knows, but it's weird and creepy and adds a lot to the game just by being there. And I do mean the game, because even outside of adding a lot of visual personality, having almost every room look different or having unique details put into them really helps the locations stand out in the player's mind, which in turn helps the backtracking. And we can't talk about the art of Silent Hill without touching on the monster designs. Ito apparently based his core monster design on taking something vaguely humanoid but exaggerating aspects of them in monstrous and usually symbolic ways. Silent Hill 1 was mostly sparse on this, and there are obvious exceptions in all of them, but the principle holds through with Silent Hill 2 being the very clear winner in terms of the series' monster designs. The whole symbolic monsters aspect has been covered forever, but what really sells Silent Hill monsters that, while they may be humanoid, they've never at any point been human. Notice how few monsters in Silent Hill have eyes or even identifiable faces. Either they all have blank flesh, no head at all, or something covering their face which shouldn't be there, like the giant mouth with a closer, or just pyramid head in general. Even the monsters which have human faces, like the nurses in Silent Hill 1 and 3, have design elements which make them very clearly wrong and off-putting. The big parasitic growth on their back in Silent Hill 1, or the odd puppet-like movements in Silent Hill 3. What also adds to this alien feel to them is how most are purely organic creatures, with even what appears to be clothing on things like the closer or slurper from Silent Hill 3 being basically just oddly shaped flesh. And at last, we have to talk about what most people find themselves most invested in with Silent Hill, the storytelling. Just to keep it in the broad strokes, storytelling here covers the story, characters, atmosphere, all that good stuff. And one of the most important defining traits of Silent Hill is the lonely vibe each of the games gives off, due to the presentation, the number of characters making up the cast, and the way that conversations are framed. One of the easiest ways that Silent Hill games accomplish this is due to their small cast sizes, with only 6 core members in Silent Hill 1, 5 or 6 depending on how you count in Silent Hill 2, and only 4 in Silent Hill 3. On top of that, the fact that the generally small cast doesn't interact very often, and rarely in situations other than one-on-one interactions, also aids the feeling of isolation the games are known for. It isn't the small number of characters alone that makes it, however, because how the characters speak with each other is also a major factor. I think the term Lynchian is thrown around way too often whenever discussing Silent Hill, but I'll admit the one thing that the original Silent Hill games did that does remind me of David Lynch's work is how dialogue is presented. In a lot of Lynch movies, we see characters talking past each other with vague, off-putting phrases or tones, awkward pauses between sentences in a conversation, and just a generally uncomfortable vibe to interactions. Movies like Eraserhead and Lost Highway really capture what I'm talking about, and these are elements that the Silent Hill games embraced wholesale. From the complete nonsense that Dahlia spouts, to Maria's inexplicable calm and then tone whiplash in the labyrinth, and how in all three it becomes very clear that the characters might not be seeing the same things as one another. This kind of bizarre presentation is common for the token quote-unquote crazy or mysterious characters and stories, but in Silent Hill, almost every major character in the narrative is like this. And while there's a lot of obvious content which makes up a Silent Hill story, like occult and religious elements, personal trauma as a driving plot point, and a lot of elements in-game being used for symbolism, the key feature that makes all of these work in Silent Hill is a respect for the audience. Most of the details are rarely directly pointed out to the player and are extremely easy to miss if the player is just rushing through and not paying attention. Silent Hill tends to leave a lot of its underlying themes, ideas, and big picture plot explanations unsaid, and respects the audience to piece things together on their own, rather than just bashing them over the head with a full-on explanation. I wouldn't necessarily call any of these games subtle. I mean, not when Silent Hill 2 ends with shit like this, but they respect the player's intelligence and investment in the story in a way few other games at the time really did. So that's my extremely broad strokes take on what exactly makes a Silent Hill game. As said before, you can probably break this down 6 ways from Sunday, but it's what we'll have in mind moving forward. Now, we'll go through the 4 Western games and see where I feel they dropped the ball in capturing the spirit of the core series. Just for the record, Silent Hill Origins actually comes closer to emulating the original Silent Hill games than any of its successors. However, while it's an earnest attempt to emulate the games, probably more by the numbers than any of the 3 to come after, it's for that reason that Origins might actually be the worst of all the Western games. The best comparison I can make is that Origins feels like a straight-to-DVD horror movie sequel. It's a lower budget, shallow imitation of what came before that tries to hit the exact same beats as the original without the resources or vision to recapture it. Origins is also similar to Silent Hill Homecoming in the sense that both had this bizarre push for combat to become the center stage of the gameplay. In Origins, this amounts to some truly irritating decisions to force the player into fighting monsters. Rather than balance allowing for running away as a combat alternative like the old games, Origins really nerfs this option in 2 different, equally baffling ways. First, the game has a hidden stamina bar which slows your running speed down to barely over a walk. You can only know you're about to reach this state by actually reaching it, and the only way to recover is to either wait it out or use the newly introduced energy drink item, which the game really doesn't have that many of lying around. Silent Hill 2 and 3 had something similar to this with a hidden stamina bar, but the major difference is that the slower running speed didn't feel like I was playing as some winded asthmatic. On top of that, running away is made even harder by almost every enemy having a command grab sort of attack. Instead of just using attack animations like the old games, which you could dodge around as a practice, the game just loves having enemies now grab a hold of you and for you to enter a quick time event sequence to break free. The proximity for them grabbing you is also pretty big, so more often than not, killing every enemy you come across is actually the best option just to save health resources. Which brings us to the combat itself, which also misses the goal of the original. Rather than making it a basic affair of just pulling out a pipe and smacking a monster to death, or shooting it if you can spare the ammo, Origins makes it a bit more complicated with the inclusion of destructible weapons. The game world is littered with weapons to pick up because they all have the durability of wet cardboard and usually break after killing an enemy or 2, at most. What ends up happening is that you clog your inventory with potentially dozens of weapons which you cycle between in real time. And to do this, you use a finicky menu that's pulled straight from Silent Hill 4 of all games. And with how awkward it is to switch weapons in real time, the most effective strategy is to smack a monster until one of your weapons breaks, and then slowly punch the thing to death with Travis's stun locking left and right combo. It's tedious, but it's extremely effective even to the endgame. And while the game does have level design that's interwoven and labyrinthine like the older games, Origins goes way overboard with the sheer size of the maps. The only sensibly sized level, in my opinion, is the returning Alchemilla Hospital, with its layout ripped straight from the first Silent Hill. Everything after that, especially the massive Cedar Grove Sanitarium, is so large that the mandatory backtracking feels less like a satisfying Zelda dungeon and more like this massive, tedious maze. This is made worse by the game's use of the Otherworld. As I said in my Silent Hill 4 retrospective, the criticism of the Otherworld being an element of the first 3 Silent Hills, which forced you to play the same level twice, is extremely misleading. In those games, you only had to play through a full standard level and its Otherworld variant a couple of times at most, and the transition to the Otherworld in those cases led to new level layouts that were so visually distinct that they barely resembled the same one. In Origins, however, you have to traverse these already massive levels basically twice, as the Otherworld works exactly like the Dark World from Link to the Past of all games, as you can go back and forth on a whim using a mirror. From an art direction standpoint, outside of Alchemilia, both the Fog and Otherworld variants of the levels are just so visually samey and bland that it can actually get pretty difficult to navigate just based on how similar every room looks. Once again, the Cedar Grove Sanitarium is the worst offender, as not only does the level lack any real memorable visual landmarks, but both the Fog and Otherworlds look so similar to one another, both just being dilapidated buildings. Silent Hill 2 had a very similar looking Otherworld, and even that managed to have a better visual contrast. But really, that can sum up the art of Origins in a nutshell. Extremely bland when it's original, lifting from past games almost wholesale when it is not. Origins began the trend of wholesale copying from Silent Hill 2, which you could accuse almost every Western game in the series for doing. The lion figures, nurses, and a custom OC Do Not Steal Pyramid Head all rear their heads this time around. And for what Monsters Origins does create on its own, a lot of the art elements of the original games are just lost here. For what it is worth, the Caliban monster is the one original creature design of honestly any of the Western games that I really do think captures the feel of what Ito wanted to do with Silent Hill monsters. It's also unique among them for just the sheer size of it, and honestly it's the one element in Origins which kinda gets to me. I don't know, something about how the thing looks and moves and just how big the damn thing is off-putting, in a very good way. How Origins does its story as well also ticks a lot of the boxes I laid out for what I feel makes the Silent Hill story. Strange, small cast of characters, most of them talking right past each other and leaving about as quickly as they arrive, the cult being present, and leaving things unsaid for the audience to pick up on their own, like the main character Travis being a serial killer. But while it does have some of the elements here, the execution leaves a lot to be desired, and you can tell the team didn't know how to make them work in the first place. I think a lot of it comes from how Origins likes to fully embrace the schlock and horror cheese, which the original games only dabbled in. The cult are now literal robed freaks with grand altars for their rituals. Alessa goes full Super Saiyan at the end in a scene which would later appear in the god-awful Silent Hill Revelations, and a lot of the magical elements which the original mentioned but refrained from showing are now on full display. While I'll readily admit that one of the major issues Silent Hill 3 had was how it handled tone, as the game would lapse into the silly a bit too much for my taste, at the very least, it didn't have the player gunning down Satan at the end with an AK and a Magnum. And even for the elements which are left more in the background, Origins botches those by having them basically be irrelevant. Ask yourself this: what exactly is the point of Travis being a serial killer and the entire subplot with the Butcher? What does it add to the backstory of Silent Hill 1? Hell, what thematic content does it add to the story as is? As presented, the whole serial killer angle is basically just a random, meaningless detail which could have been removed entirely, and the game would be no worse off for it. And Origins also featured another one of the worst aspects of the Western take on Silent Hill, which I've heard be referred to as Therapist Town. Okay, so here's the gist of it. Silent Hill 2 gets a lot of praise for its more intimate, psychological take on the characters and how the story is all about that, which the Western games decided to emulate and interpret as Silent Hill being a place where emotionally troubled people go to face their inner demons and come out the other end as more emotionally stable people. Shattered Memory is the most literal example of them, as it takes place mostly in a therapist's office, and Downpour even ends with the two leads hugging it out for fuck's sake. While this is all well and good, more than anything, it fundamentally misunderstands why the idea of Silent Hill turning someone's own mind into a living hellscape was so effective. In the old games, Silent Hill was indifferent to the protagonist and their struggles at the best of times, and gleefully malicious about them at worst. You can argue and interpret as to why whatever spiritual influence in the town wants to use manifestations of a victim's mind against them. I have my own theory on that, but it's neither here nor there. The point is, Silent Hill makes people physically and mentally suffer and doesn't seem too invested in their own well-being afterward. It wasn't some harsh, but overall therapeutic purgatory where you would find some sort of inner peace by the end, because that pretty much takes all the horror out of the situation. Hell, Silent Hill 2, which really started this trend, only has one ending where the protagonist James Sunderland manages to leave, and for good reason. The town more than likely would have been happy for him to fight it during his journey there, as a decent chunk of the game's foreshadowing pointed towards happening. In comparison, most of the Western games feel sappy, and this really just takes the teeth out of the town as an antagonist. Just my read on it, of course. There's a reason why we're not talking about the lore and specific plot details at all while discussing the Western Silent Hill games and where they go wrong. And that reason is Silent Hill Homecoming, a game that so fundamentally misunderstands the lore of Silent Hill you can make an entire video on that and that alone, which I'm sure many already have. If Silent Hill Origins is a low-budget straight-to-video sequel to a classic horror movie, then Silent Hill Homecoming would be the video game equivalent of a trashy remake of one, which doesn't even attempt to capture the feel of what came beforehand. Gameplay-wise, Homecoming either misunderstands or outright ignores the core pillars of Silent Hill's gameplay design. Right off the top, the game has some truly uninspired level design, which more often than not just boils down to moving in a straight line. Just look at the hotel level, for example. While it looks on the surface like a traditional real-world locale turned into a game environment level from one of the older games, looks can be deceiving. As you progress through it and the map is filled in, you realize that you're really just progressing in one direction. You're not actually exploring anything, and the backtracking is just walking forward, reaching the endpoint, turning right around, and walking right back in the same direction. The majority of the levels in Homecoming are like this, with the worst offender being the graveyard that you have to run through 3 times. With the level design botched, the combat takes center stage more than any other game in the series. Homecoming's apparently improved combat was the big selling point it had over the core Silent Hill games, with the latter being derided a fair bit by the promotional material. As we went over though, the combat was balanced in a very specific way in the older games, and it being awkward and simplistic served a purpose. Homecoming instead takes that system, chucks it in the trash, and replaces it with essentially the Ocarina of Time Z-targeting combat. We could get into the specifics about why I'd argue the combat doesn't work, but since this isn't a review, the point is it misses the point of Silent Hill's combat balancing by making the combat the lead gameplay hook, making avoiding combat next to impossible with slow movement speed. And the puzzles, well, across the board they just seem to be neutered, with sliding block puzzles and Mastermind being the most notable inclusions. This makes sense, at least, as exploring the level for puzzle items wouldn't make sense in a game that hardly has any exploration. The art for Homecoming isn't like the games at all. No, Homecoming's primary goal is to replicate the movie, complete with the exact same design of Pyramid Head, who does not belong here, and the Otherworld, which has this rusted hellscape look despite Alessa not being involved in this game's plot whatsoever. There really isn't much to comment about the art, because unlike Origins, Homecoming isn't even trying to capture the look of the Team Silent games. I mean, I guess you can bring up elements like the enemies having identical features like clear faces, having a lot of inorganic elements added like leather bindings, and straight up just having guys with pipes and guns show up as enemies, but does it matter? And again, like, You could also talk about how the game has two color tones, gray and film grain orange, with almost nothing added into the environments to liven them up, but it's just kicking a dead horse at this point. Speaking of dead horses, let's get the storytelling errors out of the way. Silent Hill Homecoming doesn't understand the lore of Silent Hill. At all. It's the most talked about part of this game, everyone's complained about it, hell, I complained about it at length on stream. But it's not relevant as to why Homecoming's story falls flat as a Silent Hill narrative. The biggest offenses are all in the presentation. As I said earlier, Homecoming is sort of like the video game version of a trashy Americanized reboot or remake of a classic horror franchise. Characters are screaming all the time, monsters are big and angry behemoths that go rawr. There's a fat comic relief sidekick spouting dumb one-liners, a feature that Team Silent shot down themselves for Silent Hill 2, a generic love interest is shoehorned in for a romance angle that nobody wanted or asked for, name the cliche, Homecoming probably has it. It feels more like a soulless design by committee Hollywood adaptation than the actual Hollywood adaptation. And rather than being portrayed as a lonely journey through an indifferent dreamlike purgatory, Homecoming Silent Hill feels more like a zombie movie most of the time, with monsters surrounding the cast, breaking in at inconvenient times, and raiding locations where the main character unironically does the stupid action movie shotgun cocking thing. If you were to make a parody of what an American Silent Hill reboot would look like, the result would be uncomfortably close to Homecoming. And it doesn't even get the lonely atmosphere down. Alex is constantly running into new characters, random human goons, and the new common enemy archetype in the game's second half. And he even has something of a party with his girlfriend and stupid comic relief sidekick. You know, I've compared Homecoming to the movie in the past, but you know, that's actually unfair. At the very least, the movie made some kind of attempt to replicate the feel of the first game, while at the same time doing its own thing. Results will vary on how successful it was at that, but Homecoming didn't even bother. I think the fanbase is a little quick to call Homecoming the worst game in the series since, you know, on its own, it's mediocre at best and just subpar at worst. But judging it as a continuation of Silent Hill, yeah, Homecoming is the low bar. However, if you're wondering what the actual worst game in the Silent Hill series is, if we're not including something like the HD collection, yeah, it's Silent Hill Downpour. It's also the one I have almost nothing to say about. I can see elements of the core Silent Hill gameplay pillars, but like Origins, it does nothing remarkable. Most elements like the combat exploration are even just done poorly. And even worse, there's a clear moment at the very end where the whole thing just gives up and devolves into running sequences and combat arenas. But this isn't a review of the game, so I digress. However, it is the only game out of the lineup where I have to specifically talk about the music. See, even the Western games had one thing consistently right and in line with the core Silent Hill, and that was the soundtrack by series composer Akira Yamaoka. The man's style is iconic and a key component of what makes the atmosphere of Silent Hill such a standout. His style evolved alongside the game, and in each one he brought something new to the table with each entry. From the grungy industrial noise of the first Silent Hill, to the hazy, dreamlike Silent Hill 2, the melancholic trip-hop of Silent Hill 3, and the colder, detached Silent Hill 4, it's all integral to the mood and experience. For all I ranted about how much Homecoming gets wrong with Silent Hill, even that game still had Yamaoka provide moody, tone-setting music. Downpour is the first game in the series that completely lacks a soundtrack by Yamaoka, which becomes apparent the further in you get. Never could I describe a Silent Hill soundtrack as entirely forgettable, but here's Downpour. No scene has fitting music to elevate the material, no location has proper ambient tracks to raise the atmosphere, and the game ends with an honest-to-God metal song by Korn over the credits. Yeah, remember Korn, guys? How tone-deaf can you possibly be to include nu metal in a Silent Hill game? Even Homecoming didn't do that. Downpour doesn't sound the part, and it sure as hell doesn't look it either. Just looking at the other world is enough to know the team didn't get it, though you'd be forgiven for not seeing it, considering that you just run through the other world in this game to avoid the Adobe After Effects monster. Seriously, what were they thinking when they made this thing? And yeah, I get the symbolism, running from your past, it's still stupid. Silent Hill 3 literally had this section as a joke making fun of cheap horror, and Downpour had it as a core feature. Make of that what you will. But the Otherworld design itself misses the point of the Otherworld entirely. In Downpour, it's a giant, impossible space-filled tick-tock clock, complete with slides if it wasn't already too much like Mario 64. The Otherworld in the real Silent Hill games was presented more like a poison that seeped into the world and corrupted it. The layout and location remained the same, but changed in ways that were both reflective of the inner turmoil of the character's psyche and effective as horror set pieces. Here, the Otherworld is just a big, over-the-top, and zany obstacle course, with none of the layouts or appearances reflecting the levels in the Fog world beforehand. And when we get the enemies, well, just look at them. We've gone from organic creatures designed to be completely inhuman mirrors of aspects of a character's personality and struggles to literally just dudes, Rubber Johnny, and the alien resurrection monster. Some of them have screwed up faces, sure, but what an uncreative fall from grace. At least Homecoming's monsters look like actual monsters. And when we get to the story, I'll have to give Downpour at least some props. It does at least understand how isolation and having what people you do meet be somewhat aloof and weird does help create a sense of loneliness. The game does have clear themes it wants to explore as well and centers most of its cast around them. The biggest issue just boils down to one major aspect that is missing here. While obviously the writing and the execution of everything here is just bad, again not a review, what Downpour lacks that the Team Silent games had was a respect for the player. The mysterious characters are all so smug and on the nose about how they understand the situation and Murphy doesn't. Like they're all just Vincent from Silent Hill 3 without the moments of fallibility that character gets. The script just rams this in your face with basically every encounter, the Postman character in particular being the worst example. And while the game does have prominent core themes, Downpour is not at all subtle about it. The game is constantly screaming punishment, responsibility, revenge, and forgiveness in the player's face, with the scene towards the end basically doing a horror game version of the "it's not your fault" scene from Good Will Hunting. It's all surface level and in your face about all of it. You could also point out how said themes are essentially dependent on the whole Paragon or Renegade moral choicism that was shoehorned in here, but again, not a review. Admittedly, this entire video was a bit scatterbrained, but I do hope my point is illustrated here about how most of the Western games really fail to capture the feel of a Silent Hill experience. To end this though, let's briefly touch on one of the Western Silent Hill games we didn't talk about, Shattered Memories. I left it for last because, honestly, for all its faults, I think Shattered Memories managed to actually capture some of the magic that made the original games. From a gameplay point of view, it absolutely does not and doesn't even try to play like them. However, when getting to at least what I value most about Silent Hill, the story and atmosphere, Shattered Memories actually nails it. While the cast isn't as condensed as the past games, with 6 or 7 major members and 2 very minor side characters who barely factor into the big picture, how they're utilized is quite clever. See, Harry Mason is the perspective the audience doesn't leave, and Shattered Memories finally grasps how to present a situation where characters are clearly not seeing or experiencing what the protagonist is. Even with all of the nightmarish events that Harry and the player are witness to, it seems like everyone else treats situations they're in like they're entirely normal. From characters not reacting to or even seeing the Otherworld and the monsters in it, to another one aging back and forth with no explanation, the nightmare Harry is trapped in is one that only he can face, which is in line with the lonely vibe of the past entries. And like the best games in the series, Shattered Memories makes these characters the core focus of the plot's events. And like the old games, Shattered Memories has a fair bit of respect for the player. While it does open with that cringy psychological warning, for the most part Shattered Memories deals with some pretty heavy topics and themes, doing so without coming across like it's talking down to the player or skimping on the subject matter. Without really getting into it, Shattered Memories feels more in line with the tone and broad strokes of the past Silent Hill games, while still being generally unique from them and doing its own things. I think it's because of all of this that Silent Hill fans, who usually are damn picky about the games, like yours truly, look back on it with some real fondness. And considering it's a Western studio recapturing the magic of the old games without the involvement of the original staff outside of Yamaoka's soundtrack, I'm actually going to change my stance on the potential future of Silent Hill. While I previously argued that Silent Hill really should just stay dormant, going over the games again, I think with some time and care on the developer's part, a return to Silent Hill could potentially be both a respectful continuation of what people valued in the original games, while also bringing its own unique content to the table. Or, they could instead pump out 2 mobile games and make some DLC skins for another one. Either works.